Unbelievable. Biased security guards shocking encounter with migrant stopped at airport in the middle of a busy morning. Diplomat reveals true identity. Shah Nawaz had never thought fate would land him in the lowest pit of shame and sorrow. Nor did he know how much more he had to fall and how helpless he could feel. The turns of his destiny had made him curse himself several times. As he got into the police van, he thought that hope would never find him, that good times would never return, and that his ending would not be happy. That day, the sun was exceptionally bright. Its hot, scorching rays made people sweat within minutes. However, the hot weather didn't stop people from going about their business. The capital city of Minnesota, Minneapolis, was buzzing with bustling streets, car horns, and people's noise. Life had awoken with the rise of the day. In the same city, if you wandered through the busy town to the Minneapolis Paul International Airport, you would find the airport full of people. Each was going his own way, finding a way to his destination and engrossed in his life. Regarded as the busiest airport in the upper Midwest, this street Paul International Airport hosted all the major American and international airlines. And so, suiting its reputation, it was filled with people from many countries. This huge airport witnessed the come and go of people of all nationalities. Some were confused, some were confident, and some enjoyed their travel moments. Those were the days when Minneapolis supported Afghan immigration, and records of about 1,300 evacuees had been made. It was quite a number, and settling them all in Minnesota City was a tremendous effort. The government had taken multiple measures, and the Cultural Society had taken the vital role of refugee resettlement agency. Relations between Afghanistan and America were becoming stronger, and this city was a good host for the immigrants. However, the tussle between the Taliban of Afghanistan and Russia was still going on. Some people supported Afghans and some didn't, and David Hudson was one of the non-supporters. According to him, the problem of Afghans should stay with Afghans. They had no business thundering into his country. They came in huge numbers and wrecked his lovely country. Besides, according to him, the government should have remained neutral and let the war go on because it was an issue that the people of Afghanistan had made themselves. The people of David's country weren't responsible for their issues, and so they weren't obliged to host Afghanistan's wild and uncivilized people. All the people barging into his country flustered and irritated him, and seeing them come to the airport every day was a matter of extreme tolerance for him. David Hudson was a security guard at the Paul International Airport. This transportation security officer came to the airport daily to perform his duty. He was particularly rash and stern with the immigrants, and the poor people didn't know what they had done wrong. David's colleagues knew how biased he was. While some tried to calm him down and make him understand, others just enjoyed the situation. Paul Carner was another security guard at the airport and knew full well how frustrated David was with the subject. Paul had a lot of fun triggering David and seeing him bully any Afghan. The same thing happened that day, but none of them knew that it would give rise to an issue so big that they would never try to trigger any immigrant again. That day, David came to the airport in a severely bitter mood. He probably had another fight with his wife, Paul thought. But David was all scowls and frowns that day, and nothing improved the situation. A storm was coming, and it was simmering hot. Paul gestured towards him when David came walking on the hard, polished floor towards his duty area. But David chose better to ignore him. Just then, as Paul walked towards him, a flight landed, straight from Afghanistan. Paul smirked mischievously. It was a perfect time to take advantage of the situation. He edged a bit near David. "Hey, what's up?" asked Paul in a light tone, taking a side glance at David. "You better go back to your assigned spot, Paul," David said without turning or looking at him. "But I was just going to tell you an important thing, David," Paul said with feigned innocence and loyalty, his eyes roaming around, looking for something. "You know what will happen if you don't return now." Paul didn't know if it was a real warning or a regular threat. However, Paul continued without wasting a minute. "But do you know what will happen if you don't listen to me?" There was something in his tone that made David look at him. He raised an eyebrow at Paul. Paul was looking at something or perhaps someone. David followed his gaze, an Afghan. The Afghan was about 6 feet tall, with light brown hair and hazel eyes. He was middle-aged, but wrinkles on his face hinted at his early aging. There were specks of silver gray within the brown hair, and his beard was the same color. His body seemed well-built and sturdy, but had lost strength over tough times. He carried a bag over his shoulders and was dressed in modest shalwar kameez. His gait and personality hinted that he had probably seen great times, but worst had followed later. However, David and Paul had no interest in his story. They were watching him closely. Although the Afghan seemed unconcerned by what was happening around him at the airport, his eyes dashed here and there too often. His grip on his bag was terse, and his steps were long, ready to jump out of the airport at any cost. David's eyes narrowed at his somewhat suspicious movements. Paul looked at David and smirked. "And you know what?" Paul whispered while tilting his head towards him. David slowly turned towards him. Paul looked straight into his eyes. "He is coming right towards you." David's head snapped back to the Afghan. He was indeed coming straight towards David. Not to encounter him, but to go towards the exit right behind David. David's eyes narrowed. The moment had arrived that David wouldn't forget his whole life, and it would not only be David, but also Paul, the Afghan, and everyone else at the airport. Just as the Afghan was about to pass him, David stepped sideways on purpose so he could bump into him. The Afghan was so busy walking straight towards the exit that he did not see that coming. He was about to topple sideways but gained balance at the last moment. The Afghan seemed to have come out of a daze, because it took him a minute to understand the situation. And as soon as he did, he quickly tried to step towards the door, but David would not let his prey get out of his hands so soon. David called out to him, "Hey, mister." Afghan was so close to the door, but not out yet. He tried to imply that he had not heard or known that David was talking to him. However, he was stopped at the last moment, and it was not David but Paul that had reached and stopped him. A feral combination of fury, helplessness, and fear was etched on his face as David took long dugs towards him. "Where do you think you are running?" David growled. Apparently, Paul had already sensed that the Afghan would run away and had gone towards the exit long before David had called out to the man. This was his wise, or rather nasty thinking to corner the Afghan without anywhere to run. And now that he stood between them, David would do the rest of the job. The Afghan took a deep breath and turned his head toward the two guards, like a prey between predators, a person cornered at a bad time. He grimaced as wild thoughts seemed to run through his head, but David was not concerned. Rather, he put a sturdy and rough hand on his shoulder, which made him look towards him. "Why are you in such a hurry, gentlemen?" David smiled a poisonous smile. "I am..." The Afghan started in a typical Afghan accent, but David did not let him complete his sentence. "Might we have a look at your luggage and passport?" David continued. The Afghan hesitated momentarily before removing his shoulder bag and opening the zip. Nothing important except clothes, cash, and his passport seemed to be there. Oh, his passport. David's eyes quickly scanned the inside of his bag before he picked up his passport. Nothing else was particularly of interest, perhaps. Paul watched with keen eyes while the Afghan tried to keep his breaths normal and his eyes focused. The name Mahmoud Sultan was mentioned on it. "So, Mahmoud Sultan." David eyed the passport and turned it over. The Afghan looked at him carefully. "Yes." He stammered after a pause. "Are you Mahmoud Sultan?" A twisted smile on David's lips made the Afghan's breaths hitch. His eyes were locked onto David's eyes. Paul watched with interest. Just then, another guard came there, disturbing the powerful moment. "Is something wrong?" David scowled at himself. Perhaps they had been standing there for a bit too long, so immersed in the situation, unaware of the eyes of passers-by and others at the airport. David and the guard talked in fervent language, David explaining something to him, while Paul looked at the Afghan's paling face. Then, after a few moments, the other guard turned towards Afghan and asked him, "Do you have an ID card, sir?" The guard asked him professionally. "ID." He whispered, looking as if trying to remember something. Then he nodded his head and reached inside his bag. He pulled out an Agna citizen's ID card and handed it to him. The guard took a look and was going to turn it back to him when David stopped his hand and took it from him. The guard looked bewildered towards him. Meanwhile, the Afghan seemed relieved, as if he had finally passed a checkpost, and he seemed worried again. "Were you born in 1950 or 1952? David asked suddenly, his eyes glinting. Yes, sir." The Afghan stammered as if trying to understand what he was saying. But Paul probably understood the situation and paced towards David. His eyes widened as he saw what David was trying to implement. The date of birth on the ID card and passport were different, probably a few years, but that mild mistake made him a suspicious figure. Plus, he was not answering anyone or explaining his situation, which might mean he did not understand their language or was not choosing to answer them on purpose. Moreover, as the security thickened and the Afghan was taken from the airport towards the police vans, David explained how his actions had also been mysterious and suspicious to other cops. As Agan sat in the van and was taken to the police station, he took one last look at the airport and cursed his bad luck in pure Afghani Pashto. Within a few hours, all the news channels had headlines, and every reporter announced loudly that an immigrant had been taken to the police station for investigation of suspicious actions. The news was repeated repeatedly and became the next hot topic of media discussion. The newspapers were printed with his big picture on them, but the Afghan probably did not know any of this. For now, he was locked in jail. After a few hours of interrogation and getting nothing out of him, he was sent to a rather dark and smelly room to wait for further instructions. Just as he sat on the cemented, cold floor, he remembered back in Afghanistan, when he had sat on much rougher floors for days on end, the days when Russia had taken over and was the peak time of terrorism and destruction. But it had not always been that bad, and time had also been sweet and happy. He remembered the times from childhood to marriage and finally becoming the father of twin sons. And so beautiful those two were. He remembered those lovely, innocent faces with green eyes and milky skin that were just like their mother's. He smiled a sad smile, then that had the grief of ages. Grief took over sweet memories, and the smile vanished. His head dropped, and all he could whisper to himself was, "Oh, what did you do to yourself, Shah Nawaz?" before tears started sliding down his face. If you look at the capital city of Afghanistan, Kabul, a day after this incident, you will see that this capture's news spread like wildfire. All over the country, whoever heard this news gasped or turned their heads in worry. "Did you see the news?" Ahmed screamed into the telephone. "Yes, are you talking about Shah Nawaz's dreadful capture by the police?" Saeed asked. "Of course I am. What will happen now? Will they leave him? Is he ok? Will he tell them the truth?" Ahmed ranted. "Whoa, calm down, man," Saeed said, although he was also worried about the incident. "I wonder what the Taliban will do now," Saeed continued. "Of course, they have to talk to the government. It is now a matter for the whole country. They cannot just leave him there to be tortured or..." Hamd kept going, and Saeed knew he would not stop for a long while. And well, this matter was indeed troubling. Shah Nawaz had been their close and intimate friend for a long time, but fate had been particularly harsh on him. And the past, although it brought lovely memories, had a dark stain of loss and pain. But if you go between the streets of the same city and go to the hub of the Taliban, you will see many men sitting there. The topic of discussion was, of course, the guard's last day encounter with Shah Nawaz. But how did he get caught? One of them said with great curiosity. "No one knows the full story," replied another. "It was just said that Nawaz was arrested due to suspicious actions. And I wonder what suspiciousness he had about them. He just had to do some simple steps," he continued incredulously. I was wondering the same thing. Those Americans have some keen eyes. They can spot you and find you suspicious from anywhere. They play mind games, if you ask me," one said, impressed by the capture of Shah Nawaz. "But they were not smart enough to detect Qureshi, Ghani, Malik, and much more. I say they just got lucky, or Nawaz just got unfortunate, because there was no chance he was going to get caught. Perhaps Rizwan made a mistake somewhere in the paperwork. He must have done something that might have raised suspicion," the first one said, contemplating. "But Rizwan does not always make mistakes. But if he did, it would have been ridiculous for him to get Nawaz caught. Doesn't he know what Nawaz has already gone through? The disaster with his family, home, status, and now. Another one added grimly, and all of them nodded sadly to his words. While they passed thoughts and comments outside, Rizwan answered for his actions to the high-authority Taliban member. The atmosphere was tense. "And you do not think you made any mistake?" Pasha growled at Rizwan, and Rizwan murmured something before he bowed his head. Pasha looked at him rather sternly and fiercely before saying, "They say that the date of birth was wrong. Why in the world could not you stick with a simple, pleasing date?" Huh, Rizwan. Rizwan's heart trembled at the magnitude of the mistake he had made. Perhaps he should confess his mistake, but staying muted in front of him was better. Rizwan had nowhere to run. He kept quiet while Pasha thundered at him. Rizwan admitted to himself that it was a terrible loss, but Rizwan only made mistakes once in a blue moon. And perhaps that was the worst timing ever to make a mistake, the worst mistake in the history of mistakes, he thought, while Pasha kept cursing him with red eyes and a flushed face. Finally, when his aching throat made him sit down with his head in his hands, Rizwan dared to look up. Pasha was still murmuring, but now to himself, "The leader will send the message to the American government. Let's see what happens now." And the room filled with aching silence after these words. A few days later, the country diplomat talked deeply with Minnesota's high officials. It took him a long time to explain the situation to them. They listened intently, but one thing they got stuck on was why Shah Nawaz had to do fake paperwork, and it took another hour for the ambassador to detail them with the exact circumstances. At last, they all sit back after the detailed discussion, with thoughts etched on their faces. The true story was finally revealed, and a curiosity to the scenario. Shah Nawaz had not let out any hints about the true story, despite threats and torture. And now they understood why. It was because he had suffered more miserable situations before. The diplomat told them about the story from the beginning. They needed to understand all the parts and twists that led to such a situation. So, if you go a few years back to the city of Kabul, on the paved street named Madni Street, you will see a huge mansion. A huge, grand, and magnificent building that spoke of the wealth and status of the insiders. The nameplate on the big metallic door said in bold words, Shah Nawaz. The road from the gate led to the garage of the beautiful house, and there were huge lawns on both sides. Grapevines and creepers were all over the house, and lush green lawns and beautiful flower bushes were also there. The lawn chairs outside and a swing were empty, while Shah Nawaz was inside the mansion, talking to his 2 young kids. Shah Nawaz looked younger then. He was a burly man with dimples that formed when he smiled at his twin sons, Zulfi and Zakir. Zulfi was on his father's chest, while Zakir played with Nawaz's hair. Shah Nawaz was a Sardar, the leader of his tribe, which suited him too. He was well known in the area, and everybody respected him. He had done great work for people in the area and was financially strong. He was living a happy and peaceful life, and his shining face was proof of that. Dad, Zakir called his father lovingly while tying his hair in a pony. Both brothers were 6 years old. Yes, my dear, Shah Nawaz replied. You know my classmate said there will be a war, he said hesitantly. Shah Nawaz frowned. Now did he? He asked in a low voice. Yes, Dad. He also said that all of us are going to be killed. Zulfi put his chin on Nawaz's chest and said quickly. Shah Nawaz's heart trembled and his eyes widened. Of course, that is not going to happen. Who uttered such nonsense? He took Zulfi's face in his hands and looked into his gorgeous eyes. But before he could answer, Zakir put his arms around Nawaz's neck and said with his face close to his ear, But I heard Mom talk on the phone yesterday. She was saying that there has been an attack. Shah Nawaz took Zakir into his arms, and his sons looked up at him. He said to them while holding them close, Look, whatever happens, I will always be by your side. I will never leave you. I will always protect you. And no one is going to die. Okay. Nawaz affirmed them. Both of them nodded their heads, and he kissed their foreheads. Just the thought sent trembles through him. They had not killed Nawaz because they wanted him to die in his own pain. Till then, they threw him and locked him in their prison. Torn clothes, no food and water, and no necessities were not the issue with Nawaz. The thoughts revolving around him, the picture of dead bodies, settled in his mind, and his nightmares were his problem. He did not have anything to do with the world anymore. He did not want to live anymore. He had lost everything, and on such a short notice. He remembered the promise he had made with his sons, and the terrible pain made him grip his hair and cry out wild in the night. The guards outside his prison did not leave him in peace to his thoughts. They occasionally wrung him up and beat him furiously, and then forced him to sleep on the hard, dirty, rough floor. Hours passed, or days or weeks. He did not remember anymore. The next thing that brought him to his senses was when Pasha and 2 other Taliban came to get him out of the prison. They had dealt with the guard on duty, given money to him to keep quiet, and finally taken him out of the horrific cell. And days later, he did not know how he really ended up in jail again, but in another country. Perhaps Pasha had felt guilty for the deaths of his family members because they could not solve the issue quicker and had taken it upon himself to at least get him out of prison. After they had taken him out, the next step they had done was to get him out of reach of the Russians before they could lay their hands on him again. So they made a fake passport and ID to send him to America, and they instructed him not to engage with anyone, hide in the rush of people so no one would suspect, and just go out in the country and live the rest of his life peacefully. But unfortunately, Nawaz got caught, and now the authorities had to interact with each other. It was finally decided that Nawaz could live in America or return to his country. The choice was his. The government had decided in favor of him. After deep thought, Nawaz decided that it was better for him to return to his own country, the land where he had spent his whole life and the land that had given him memories, good or bad. Nawaz wanted to do something for the country, and so he returned. And when he met and hugged Pasha at the airport, he decided to work for this country, kick the enemies out, and make it so that no family would be torn again.